Ever wonder why churches were so huge in medieval towns? Did you know some peasants never traveled beyond the shadow of their local cathedral? Have you ever thought about how a building could control your entire life? Number 5, the ultimate medieval flex, church architecture that screamed power. When you rolled up to a medieval town, you knew exactly who was in charge, no sign needed. The massive church spire towering over everything else told you everything. These weren't just buildings, they were the original skyscrapers, the medieval Manhattan skylines, except instead of competing corporations, it was just one big power player, the church. Medieval churches weren't just randomly super tall. Their height was totally intentional. Think about it, in a world without billboards, social media, or even widespread literacy, architecture was the ultimate influencer platform. The church building itself was basically a medieval billboard saying, "We're kind of a big deal." The average peasant lived in a tiny hut with dirt floors. Then they'd look up and see this mind-blowing structure with impossibly high ceilings, mysterious shadows, stunning stained glass, and stone walls carved with biblical scenes. The contrast was shocking and absolutely deliberate. Imagine living your whole life in a one-room wooden shack, then walking into a cathedral with soaring ceilings that seemed to touch the heavens. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Church architects knew exactly what they were doing, creating a physical space that made you feel small and humble while simultaneously filling you with awe. These buildings took generations to complete. Durham Cathedral's construction began in 1093 but wasn't finished for about 40 years. Cologne Cathedral took over 600 years from start to finish. The medieval mind saw something profound in this cathedral's represented work that extended beyond a single human lifespan, connecting past, present, and future generations through a shared project dedicated to God. The medieval church spire wasn't just tall for the sake of being tall. It pointed upward toward heaven, creating a literal connection between earth and sky. The tallest church spires reached over 400 feet. The Lincoln Cathedral in England briefly held the title of tallest building in the world after its spire reached 525 feet in 1311. When that spire collapsed in a storm in 1549, no building would surpass its height for nearly 300 years. Number 4, before Google Maps, how church bells controlled time and space. Quick, what time is it? You probably just checked your phone, right? Medieval folks didn't have that luxury. They had church bells. And these weren't just pretty sounds, they structured every single moment of medieval life. Church bells rang for everything. They marked the hours of prayer that divided the day, called people to mass, announced deaths, celebrated marriages, warned of danger, and even helped travelers find towns in the fog or darkness. If you heard bells, you knew civilization was nearby. Before mechanical clocks became common in the 14th century, church bells were how everyone told time. The day was divided into canonical hours marked by bells: matins midnight, lauds dawn, prime 6 a.m., terce 9 a.m., sext noon, none 3 p.m., vespers sunset, and compline 9 p.m. Even if you couldn't read, you knew exactly what time it was by the bell pattern. The church bell tower literally controlled the rhythm of medieval life: when to wake up, when the bells rang, when to eat lunch, when the bells rang, when to stop working, when the bells rang. The sound of bells was the soundtrack of medieval existence, impossible to ignore and deeply woven into daily routines. Bell ringers held serious responsibility in medieval communities. They needed to be reliable and skilled, as complicated bell patterns communicated different messages. A slow, solemn toll meant someone had died. Rapid ringing could signal fire or attack. Festive pealing announced celebrations. Medieval people could read these acoustic signals instantly, just like you can recognize different phone notification sounds. Churches didn't just dominate the skyline visually, they dominated the soundscape too. In a world before amplified sound, church bells could be heard for miles. Their sound literally defined the boundaries of a community. If you could hear the bells, you belonged to that parish. The acoustic reach of bells created invisible but very real boundaries across the medieval landscape. When a town installed a particularly large or beautiful sounding bell, it became a source of community pride. Towns actually competed to have the most impressive bells, which could cost enormous sums. The Maria Gloriosa bell at Erfurt Cathedral in Germany, cast in 1497, weighs 13 tons and required extreme wealth and technical skill to create a medieval equivalent of a space program or particle accelerator. Number 3. Medieval church, the original social media platform. Forget Facebook. The medieval church was the original social network. It wasn't just where you worshipped, it was where literally everything happened. Community announcements, church. Meeting potential spouses, church. Gossip central, definitely church. Medieval churches functioned as community centers in ways we can barely imagine today. They were often the only large indoor public space in a town. Markets might be held in the church square, town meetings in the nave, and traveling performers might even put on shows inside, though the racier acts stayed outside. Before newspapers or public bulletin boards, important announcements happened at church. Royal proclamations, new laws, warnings about criminals, upcoming marriages, all were announced during or after services when everyone was gathered. Miss Sunday Mass and you might miss critical community information. Churches weren't just serious places. Medieval religious festivals included feasts, games, drinking, and dancing, often right in the churchyard. Celebrations for saints' days could last for days and feature wild parties alongside religious observances. The famous Feast of Fools even allowed for a brief ritual inversion of social hierarchies, with lower clergy temporarily taking on roles of their superiors in a sanctioned form of carnival. For most medieval people, the parish church was the center of social obligations. Religious confraternities like church social clubs organized charity work, funerals, and commemorative masses for deceased members. Belonging to these groups created social connections that could help in business or during personal hardships. Pilgrimages organized by churches were the medieval equivalent of group travel packages. Traveling to famous shrines like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem created lifelong social bonds between pilgrims who faced the dangers of medieval roads together. People from different social classes might temporarily mingle during these journeys in ways impossible in normal village life. Even the church building itself reinforced social hierarchies. Where you sat or stood during services reflected your status. Wealthy merchants and nobility might have personal pews near the front, while ordinary peasants stood in the back. Some churches had separate entrances for men and women. The physical organization of the church mirrored the social organization of the community. Number 2, from cradle to grave, how churches owned your medieval life timeline. Born in medieval Europe. The church recorded it, getting married. The church officiated it, died. The church buried you. There was literally no escaping the church's involvement in every major life milestone. The medieval church didn't just control the big moments, it inserted itself into everyday decisions too. What foods you could eat on particular days. The church had rules for that. When you could have sex with your spouse. Church regulated that too. Thinking of charging interest on loans. The church called that usury and considered it sinful. The medieval church was basically involved in your business 24/7. Baptism wasn't just a nice ceremony, it was absolutely essential. Unbaptized babies were believed to be stuck in limbo if they died, neither in heaven nor hell. Parents rushed to have newborns baptized, often within days of birth, because infant mortality was so high. The church font literally marked your entrance into both Christian and human society. Want to get married in medieval times? You needed the church's permission. The church gradually claimed authority over marriage, declaring it a sacrament that required proper religious oversight. By the 13th century, church law required marriages to be publicly announced beforehand, the bans, performed by a priest and witnessed by the community, all to prevent secret marriages or unions between people who were too closely related. Medieval confession was intense. After the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, all Christians were required to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year. Priests had detailed handbooks called penitentials, listing appropriate penances for every imaginable sin. Your priest literally knew all your darkest secrets, creating a powerful dynamic of spiritual authority. The church even controlled your calendar. Religious holidays determined when you worked and when you celebrated. Medieval Europe had around 50 religious feast days when work was forbidden, plus Sundays. That's a lot of mandatory time off. But these weren't vacation days, you were expected to attend religious services instead. Death brought the ultimate church control. Church doctrine about purgatory meant that your soul's journey after death depended on prayers and masses said for you, which required payment to the church. Wealthy people left money for perpetual masses for their souls. Poorer people joined prayer confraternities where members promised to pray for each other after death. The church maintained power over people even beyond the grave. Number 1, cash rules everything around me. The medieval church economy. How rich was the medieval church? Try this: by the 13th century, the church owned approximately 1/3 of all land in Western Europe. 1/3. Imagine any single organization today controlling that much real estate. Tithes weren't optional, they were essentially a mandatory 10% income tax paid to the church. That's right, medieval peasants were expected to give 1/10 of their harvest or income to the church. Try to avoid paying and you might face excommunication, spiritual and social isolation from your community. The church was medieval Europe's biggest employer. Beyond priests and monks, churches hired architects, stonemasons, woodcarvers, glaziers, scribes, musicians, teachers, and administrative staff. Cathedrals were massive job creators, with construction projects sometimes lasting centuries and employing generations of craftsmen. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic powerhouses. Monks developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, operated breweries and wineries, ran hotels for travelers, hospices, maintained libraries, and pioneered banking practices. The Cistercian order became particularly famous for their wool production across Europe. Indulgences became the medieval church's most controversial revenue stream. These spiritual pardons, reducing time in purgatory, started as rewards for pious acts but evolved into something more transactional. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences were openly sold, promising spiritual benefits in exchange for cash contributions. This practice eventually helped spark the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther protested against it in 1517. Pilgrimages generated enormous economic activity. Major pilgrimage sites like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Rome itself saw thousands of visitors annually. These medieval tourists needed food, lodging, transportation, and souvenirs, creating entire economies around sacred sites. The souvenir trade in religious relics and tokens was basically the medieval equivalent of Disney merchandise. The church's wealth wasn't just in land, it was also the medieval period's primary collector and commissioner of art. Illuminated manuscripts, gold and silver reliquaries, jeweled chalices, carved altarpieces, and monumental sculptures represented vast investment in artistic production. Many of Europe's greatest artistic treasures exist because the church had both the motivation and resources to commission them. Was the medieval church entirely about control and wealth? Do these massive structures still shape our imagination today? When you see a cathedral silhouetted against the sky, are you experiencing the same awe that medieval people felt? How much has really changed in how powerful institutions use architecture, social pressure, and financial systems to maintain their influence?